An analysis of Bartleby the Scrivener, Part 2. In the beginning of the story, our narrator is described as neither very ambitious nor particularly caring. This initial characterization is challenged as the story progresses. The narrator finds fault in Nippers for being ambitious, for wanting to be more than a mere copyist. In fact, the narrator refers to ambition as diseased. He also finds Turkey to be too energetic in the afternoons, which he considers annoying. For their faults, however, the narrator still considers them to be useful. The issue of charity is very significant within the story. The narrator notes Turkey's small income and gives him a coat. He suggests, however, that this charity is problematic, that it makes Turkey insolent. He was a man whom prosperity harmed, says our narrator. Later in the story, there is another warning against charity. While it may be a kind thing, it has a selfish purpose. Mere self-interest, then, if no better motive can be enlisted, should, especially with high-tempered men, prompt all beings to charity and philanthropy. Bartleby's place in the office is interesting. The narrator finds an odd place for Bartleby to work, in his side of the office, not with the other copyists, but behind a screen, so that he can be heard and not seen. Food is also an extremely important theme within the story. Note the emphasis on eating. Nipper suffers from digestion, but they both like ginger cakes. Ginger Nut is the one who gets the food. Bartleby is first described as gorging on the writing, so there we see another reference to food. It's worth discussing whether there might be some symbolism to this mention of food or eating, and we will discuss that further within our discussion board. However, note that the narrator doesn't seem to eat. Bartleby is later described as living on only these ginger nut cakes, and apparently never leaving the office, like a hermit. The narrator is shocked when Bartleby refuses to be submissive. After all, the narrator put him in this particular place so as to be easily available for whatever trivial occasions he desired. So that leads to the question, why doesn't the narrator just fire Bartleby? The narrator seems oddly touched by Bartleby's lack of passion or anger. This was first noted when he was first doing his copying, but there was also a lack of passion in his refusal. This refusal seems to touch the narrator oddly. He says, "But there was something about Bartleby that not only strangely disarmed me, but in a wonderful manner touched and disconcerted me." Bartleby seems to actually be having an influence on the narrator himself. Note that the narrator tries to convince Bartleby to do his duty. Oddly, the boss still doesn't fire him, but rather, Bartleby's way of thinking influences him. When wondering why the spicy ginger nuts don't make Bartleby spicy, he surmises that he prefer it should have not. In other words, he's seeing a strangely powerful independent will in Bartleby that is somewhat alluring but also dangerous. Later in the story, the narrator even uses this prefer not to phrasing. In the passage below, the narrator decides not to fire Bartleby, but instead feels sorry for him and suggests keeping him as an act of charity. However, he notes that there's a selfish element to this. "He is useful to me. I can get along with him. If I turn him away, the chances are he will fall in with some less indulgent employer, and then he will be rudely treated, and perhaps driven forth miserably to starve. Yes, here I can cheaply purchase a delicious self-approval. To befriend Bartleby, to humor him in his strange willfulness will cost me little or nothing, while I lay up in my soul what will eventually prove a sweet morsel for my conscience." Oddly, the desire seems compelled to have a kind of relationship with Bartleby. There's a strange language of desire here. "I closed the door and again advanced towards Bartleby. I felt additional incentives tempting me to my fate. I burned to be rebelled against again. I remembered that Bartleby never left the office." When the narrator realizes that Bartleby has been living in the office, he feels unusual sadness. He says, "For the first time in my life, a feeling of overpowering, stinging melancholy seized me. The Scrivener's pale form appeared to me laid out among uncaring strangers, in its shivering winding sheet. It's It's very interesting to look at why this particular moment moves him so much, to the point where he would say that it is more than anything than in his life. We're going to need to talk about why the narrator uses these images of Bartleby as dead, with nobody caring. We see these images of death numerous times within the story. Note how the narrator calls Bartleby pallid. Beyond just meaning pale, this often implies death. Oddly, on page 554, the narrator has a great realization. To a sensitive being, pity is not seldom pain. And when at last it is perceived that such pity cannot lead to effectual succor, common sense bids the soul to be rid of it. What I saw that morning persuaded me that the Scrivener was the victim of an innate and incurable disorder. I might give alms to his body, but his body did not pain him. It was his soul that suffered, and his soul I could not reach. So we're going to want to talk in the discussion board about why the narrator ultimately resolves to be rid of Bartleby, and what the narrator is really seeking to get from Bartleby. Religion is definitely brought up within the story, although it's not necessarily focused on as a primary theme. After the realization that he can't really help Bartleby, the narrator feels that the things I had seen disqualified me for the time from church-going. We're going to discuss in detail what Bartleby might have meant by that particular phrase. That will help lead us into a discussion about what particular themes there might be within the story regarding religion and the concept of the soul. Note that in a few places within the story, Bartleby is described in terms of ruin, a thing of the past. For example, but he answered not a word. Like the last column of some ruined temple, he remained standing mute and solitary in the middle of the otherwise deserted room. When the narrator seems to come to a spiritual awakening, what he calls this blessed frame of mind, that maybe Bartleby has been put on the earth in order that the narrator can demonstrate kindness, compassion, and charity, he is jolted out of this by worry over how such charity might harm his professional reputation, and potentially his wallet. As the story progresses, the narrator seems to develop deeper caring for Bartleby. He offers to bring him to his own home, and at the tombs refer to him as a friend. But then the narrator calls the grub man, a total stranger, a friend. This seems to suggest that the narrator is incapable of true friendship or fully understanding the concept. In the end, he sees Bartleby lying in the yard and touch him. Note that this is the first and only time he has touched him in all of the story. Is this meant to focus the reader on the disconnection in modern life? We will discuss that in our discussion board. When the narrator learns of Bartleby's past in the dead letter office, he seems strangely touched by the blocked communications, the sad stories unfolding there. It seems that this experience with Bartleby has made him a man who is more feeling, more likely to notice and care for others. In short, he's developed empathy, which he really didn't have in the beginning of the story. The very last line seems to echo a sentiment about humanity that can be read two ways. It may be decrying the sad nature of human existence, or it might be noting how this contact with Bartleby has awakened a sense of humanity within himself. Within the discussion board, we're going to talk about the title, and particularly the setting and the subtitle, A Story of Wall Street, and what they might do in terms of influencing the eventual themes within the story. The critical opinion is divided about the narrator. One side sees him as an appealing eccentric who tries but fails to save a man who has doomed himself. Another sees him as a man who, despite his genial manner, is so devoted to the values of Wall Street that he cannot rise to the injunction of loving his neighbor as himself.